This vignette about Lieutenant James Hansell French and Victorio's Apaches is part 4 of 5 for the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 51, Killed by Indians, which you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. If you look at a Spanish map of North America from the early 1700s, you will see an area that now includes portions of Chihuahua, Sonora, Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. Because of the people who live there, this area was named Apache. It was a sprawling landscape of about 140,000 square miles of mountains and canyons, rivers and uplands, barren deserts, and near-Arctic peaks. The Apaches had lived there for many centuries. Many tribes made up the Apache. The best known are the Chiricahuas, who were called cherry cows by the settlers, the Warm Springs, or Ojo Caliente, the Mescaleros, and numerous other smaller groups. They essentially treated each other like cousins, and as in contemporary life, cousins didn't always get along. Apaches were excellent horsemen. Their primordial weapons were rocks, bows with stone-tipped arrows, lances, knives, and clubs, but no tomahawks. The white man introduced them to the rifle, and they soon became skilled with it. They acquired more rifles, either by bartering or theft. Often they would raid supply wagons and abscond with all the weapons and ammunition. And because of where they were located, their bullets were frequently made out of silver, as it was more readily available than lead. The traditional Apache weapon was the bow and arrow. The bow was usually made of mulberry. The bowstrings were made of deer tendon, later cattle or horse tendon. The arrows were made of cane. They were fletched with hawk or eagle feathers. The heads were obsidian or flint. Their maximum effective range was about 150 yards. An experienced warrior usually carried a spare bowstring and maybe an extra bow stave as well. It took more than 300 years for Apache to be settled by whites to the point of mortal conflict with its original inhabitants. The earliest contact seems to have taken place around 1530. As more Euro-Americans settled the area, the usual problems of shared resources led to a prolonged confrontation that lasted for nearly 70 years. Among the indigenous leaders of Apache were familiar names like Cochise, 1805 to 1874, Geronimo, 1829 to 1909, and Loco, 1823 to 1905. The leader of the Chihenda branch of Chiricahua was Bidu Ya, born around 1825. The Mexicans called him Victorio. His sister was the famed woman warrior Lozen, or the dexterous horse thief. In the summer of 1866, a year after the Civil War ended and more than 6 months after the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery throughout the country, the United States needed the largest peacetime army in its history. During the war, more than 185,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army and another 20,000 in the Navy. 16 had been awarded the Medal of Honor. The U.S. Colored Troops, USCT, had proven their worth, and emancipation had made several 100,000 potential recruits available. The United States Congress passed the Army Reorganization Act of 1866. It provided for 30 new regiments, each of about 800 troops, including 2 cavalry and 4 infantry regiments, quote, composed of colored men, end quote. They had voted to limit the Army to 24,000 troops. 20% would be black. Several tasks required such a sizable armed force: occupying the recalcitrant South, patrolling the Mexican border, protecting construction of transcontinental railroads, guarding wagon routes to the Colorado and Montana gold fields, And this was the harshest, most demanding sector of the Indian frontier. From 1870 to 1880, Victorio, chief of the copper mine Membreños and principal leader of all the Chejenda Apaches, along with Loco, chief of the Warm Spring Membreños and second ranking among the Chejendi, were moved to and left at least 3 different reservations, some more than once, despite their band's request to live on traditional lands. In July 1872, Brigadier General Oliver O. Howard met with Victorio and established a bond. He agreed that the Cheyennes should return to Ojo Caliente, but this was delayed pending Howard's effort to make peace with the powerful Chiricahua chief Cochise, who had ravaged Arizona for a decade. Howard succeeded, but in his mind, the creation of the Ojo Caliente Reservation was conditional on Cochise agreeing to move there. Cochise refused, so instead Howard established the Chiricahua Reservation for him in southeastern Arizona. Victorio believed, with good reason, that General Howard had promised that his band could immediately return to Ojo Caliente, and understandably he felt betrayed. But in 1877, policymakers decided to consolidate all the Apache bands at San Carlos, a hot, disease-ridden place on a parched stretch of the Gila River in Arizona. Victorio and his people were herded across the mountains to that desolate place. Many natives died from malaria, a disease they had never encountered before. Victorio and his men stayed only a few months before they had to break away and head back to their homes. Army patrols swarmed into the mountains of western New Mexico and edged Victorio northward until he surrendered at Fort Wingate. The Army was not willing to care for the prisoners so close to the Navajos, who acted as scouts for the Army and were enemies of the Apaches, so they moved them back to Ojo Caliente, pending a decision on their future. Still classified as prisoners of war, the Cheyennes awaited the government's decision with mounting frustration, and after 2 years of uncertainty and insecurity, and following yet another rumor that they were going to be moved to San Carlos, Victorio had had enough. In the autumn of 1879, he declared war. The United States had the full might of its army on its side, but several factors favored the Cheyennes. First, of course, was Victorio himself, a splendid warrior and natural leader of conviction, who often said that he would rather die than be sent back to San Carlos. Second was the physical endurance of his people, who were accustomed to traveling long distances, day and night, without rest, food, or water. Third was the tortuous nature of the country itself, the steep precipices and plunging canyons webbing the Black Range and Mogollon Mountains. The Cheyennes knew every rocky height and sinuous crevice of the tangled land, and they knew how to position themselves on craggy elevations invulnerable to enemy assault and usually ideal for ambushing any pursuing force. The natives could also travel rapidly on fresh mounts. When their horses began to break down, they simply stole remounts from the nearest ranch. The cavalry, by contrast, had to purchase their own horses or wait for their arrival from the east. Many of these animals rapidly broke down in some of the most punishing mountains in the west. Finally, the Cheyennes knew well the safety offered by the international boundary. When they were too closely pressed, they could find refuge in Mexico. And the United States and Mexico would not make an agreement to allow their armies to cross the border in pursuit of an enemy, but they frequently did so anyway. Victorio faced a strong force, principally composed of black troopers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, led by some of the Army's most skilled frontier fighters. The 9th garrisoned in New Mexico, the 10th in West Texas, into which Victorio's band occasionally spilled. Plagued in civilian life by racism and discrimination, blacks found a better life in the military. The black regiments, therefore, boasted the highest re-enlistment rates and the lowest desertion rates in the Army. But because of their limitations in education, the black troops were looked down upon by many others, especially since they did not have enough literate men to be clerks and non-commissioned officers. The senior officers were all white, of course. Colonel Edward Hatch commanded the 9th Cavalry. He had endured his own share of discrimination. Coming out of volunteer service in the Civil War as a general officer, he attained colonelcy in the regular army because of his distinguished wartime service. Such origins, rather than West Point and the regulars, counted against him, as did his command of black regiments. He passed his entire post-war career, more than a quarter of a century, commanding black regiments. Colonel Hatch also served as commander of the Territory of New Mexico, headquartered in Santa Fe. His principal field commander was Major Alfred P. Morrow, a courageous, dogged field soldier who commanded all the troops in southern New Mexico, with headquarters at Fort Bayard. And once on the trail, he refused to let go. A junior officer with this troop, which the natives had started to call the Buffalo Soldiers, was the young Philadelphian Lieutenant James Hansell French, who was born in 1851. After a public education in Philadelphia, he attended the U.S. Military Academy and graduated with honors in June 1874. At the Academy, he was popular. He earned the same reputation which his subsequent career sustained, that of a reckless, daring fellow, fond of both the dash and hardships of the soldier's life. His first assignment was with the 9th Cavalry. French, who went by his middle name, Hansell, was the son of Clayton French, 1824 to 1890, Laurel Hill East, Section J. Clayton was a pharmacist who in 1840 ran his own drugstore at the northwest corner of 10th and Market with his partner, William H. Richards, Laurel Hill East, Section L. Clayton's mother, Catherine Ann Hansell French, was the daughter of the expert watchmaker, James Morris Hansell. Despite the name French, Clayton had his roots in England, although his family had been in America for about 200 years. The original spelling of the surname was F-F-R-E-N-C-H with 2 lowercase f's. Thomas French, who had been baptized in a church in Northamptonshire in 1637, was later imprisoned because he left the Church of England and became a Quaker. It was this reason that caused him to emigrate, settle in Burlington, West New Jersey, on the 23rd of July, 1680. That's the old-style calendar. He was one of the proprietors of West New Jersey in America, having a grant of 1/19th of the 1/8 of New Jersey. Thomas's great-grandson times 5, Clayton French, and William Richards' pharmacy business had attracted the attention of another entrepreneurial pharmacist, John K. Smith, Laurel Hill East, Section G. He had opened his drugstore in 1830. When John's brother George joined the firm in 1841, it became John K. Smith and Company. In 1865, the Smiths joined with Mahlon Klein to form Smith, Klein and Company. In 1870, Smith's nephew Mahlon K. Smith, Laurel Hill East Section T, joined the firm, and in 1891, Smith, Klein and Company bought out French Richards and Company, and they became Smith, Klein and French, which became a pharmaceutical giant for much of the 20th century. In 1989, SK&F merged with the Beecham Group to form SmithKline Beecham, and in 2000, another merger formed the group GlaxoSmithKline. During his time in Texas, 2nd Lieutenant J. Hansell French saw much action against the Apaches, especially with a huge number of border cattle thieves. Sometimes he would pursue the marauders beyond the Rio Grande. Once he broke into a secret storehouse on the other side of the border. It's where their arms were kept, and he confiscated them. This defied the local Mexican authorities. For this act, he was almost court-martialed. But thanks to his superior officers, the incident went no further. Soon he was ordered to Fort Garland and marched his detachment over the desert plains for several weeks, enduring great hardships. He resigned from the Army on 31 August 1876 due to illness. But recovered 2 years later, he rejoined in August 1878. He was soon back on the frontier, taking part in hazardous missions against warring indigenous in the Southwest. By 1 January 1880, Arizona included in its department 13 posts and 2 military depots. Brevet Major General Edward Hatch, colonel of the 9th Cavalry and commanding the District of New Mexico, ordered his entire regiment to the southern part of the territory and took personal command, assuring himself of unrivaled abuse from territorial newspapers which expected military miracles. Within the new year, Victorio again came north, killed an occasional prospector, ripped down telegraph wires, and fought whites here and there. The hellhounds are again at work in New Mexico, sighed the Star, the local newspaper. Mexican General Geronimo Trevino, who launched an operation with 400 men against Victorio on December 28th, was credited with driving him across the borderline, but Victorio was often pursued and rarely driven. Major Morrow was supposed to be the stone wall against which Victorio would smash himself. The Star announced on January 8th that, quote, General Carr and Major Morrow have the renegades about where they want them, end quote. But Victorio's fighters whiffed past like shadows, and 2 days later they were reported in the Black Mountains, Morrow with 5 companies of cavalry in pursuit, 24 hours behind. Then on the upper Rio Puerco, on 12 January, Morrow caught up and a sharp fight ensued, lasting from about 2 in the afternoon until dark. Several indigenous were thought to have been hit. Morrow reported the deaths of Sergeant Gross and the wounding of 2 of his men. The hostiles then broke for the San Mateo Mountains, northeast of Fort Bayards, where they were overtaken within a week. On 17 January 1880, 2nd Lieutenant James Hansell French, while serving under Major Morrow, was killed by Apaches while pursuing Victorio in the mountains. He was 28 years old. His comrade, Lieutenant M.W. Day, wrote a letter to Clayton French. It becomes my painful duty to inform you of the death of your son, J. Hansell French, who was killed at the head of his company in action with Victoria's band of hostile Indians in the San Mateo Mountains, New Mexico, about 25 miles from Ojo Caliente, on the 17th. There was a 5-week delay before his body was returned to his family, and he was interred at Laurel Hill East, Section J, Lot 112, on February 28, 1880. He has a beautiful marker on his grave. After the battle at San Mateo, the Apache once again escaped, and once more the hard-riding Major Morrow and his campaign-wearied troopers pushed on along Victorio's trail, across the Rio Grande, and again they caught up, this time on 3 February 1880, in a canyon northeast of Ailman's Well, on the Jornada de Muerte near the San Andres Mountains. Parts of 5 companies, plus the Indian scouts, ran into the hostiles, who had been placed, quote, in squads of 15 or 20 men upon the sides of the canyon, end quote. Morrow drove them from ledge to crevice, but the task was hopeless. As soon as one enemy unit was routed, others opened up. The following day, the fight was resumed half-heartedly. Victorio broke off, and this time the U.S. troops did not pursue. Morrow's men had shot their bolt. They were utterly worn out, they were low on ammunition, and their supplies were about gone. A single unit was sent to pursue Victorio into the San Andres, a company under Captain H.L. Rucker that chased the enemy for 2 days, coming suddenly upon them strongly fortified in a narrow and rough canyon of the mountains. The troops were greeted by heavy fire, and several men and horses fell. The Apache perceived their advantage and charged the troops, who gave way and retreated in confusion. Now Victorio became the pursuer and drove the troops across the river. In the retreat, rations and bedding were abandoned, which the Apache secured. 2 more companies of the 9th hurried south from Santa Fe, and Hatch again hastened onto the field, this time with more than 1,000 troops. In a lengthy report written on 25 February from Ojo Caliente, Hatch described their work and the miserable conditions under which it was performed. The terrain, he explained, made the well-known Modoc lava beds a lawn by comparison. U.S. cavalry and infantry units chased Victorio and his band of men all over the Arizona and New Mexico territories during spring and summer, picking off a few members of his band here and there, losing more men and horses to injuries, illness, exposure, and Victorio once again slipped into Mexico to recuperate. For months, there were other battles that raged in a war of attrition for both sides. On the afternoon of 14 October, 1880, about 1,000 Mexican troops under General Joaquin Terrazas tracked down the marauders, assisted by token representation from troops north of the border. On daybreak on the 15th, the battle ended. Victorio, repeatedly wounded, was finished off by a Tarahumara scout named Mauricio Corredor, who received a reward of $3,000 and a fancy nickeled rifle. There are no eyewitness accounts of the death of Victorio, at least none are known to exist, and there was some question as to whether he ended his own life. In this great slaughter, Terrazas slew 78 Apaches, including Victorio and 60 warriors, plus a number of women and children, and he captured 68 women and children and 200 horses and mules. And much to the irony of the black troops, many of those captured were sold into slavery. 30 Apache escaped. Terrazas' losses were 3 killed and as many wounded, showing that Victorio's people were almost completely out of ammunition. Victorio's sister, the warrior Lozin, was one of the few who escaped to continue the battle. 5 weeks later, on 16 November, 30 or 40 Apaches ambushed Terrazas' troops on the high road between Chihuahua and El Paso, south of Carrizal, and 9 Mexicans were killed outright. Among them was a sergeant who was mounted on Victorio's saddle and carrying a few trinkets from the body of the slain chief. The sergeant's corpse was slashed into tiny pieces by the enemy. The death of Victorio did not end the Apache Wars, which sputtered on for another 40-plus years. The last Apache raid into the United States occurred in 1924, less than 100 years ago, when a war party of natives, who were later caught and arrested, stole some horses from Arizona settlers. This was considered to be the end of the American Indian Wars, but the Apache-Mexican Wars continued for another 9 years until the final holdouts were defeated at the Caste War of Yucatan in 1933. Several resistance groups held out in the Sierra Madre Mountains, with sightings ranging from 1952 all the way to 2017, with some possible sightings from local ranchers, hikers, or explorers. Currently, there are Apache communities in Oklahoma and Texas, and reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. Apache people have moved throughout the United States and elsewhere, including urban centers. The Apache nations are politically autonomous. They speak several different languages and have distinct cultures. Nearly 200,000 U.S. citizens call themselves Apache. You have been listening to an excerpt from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 51, Killed by Indians. It is one of hundreds of vignettes to be found among the stones at both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West cemeteries. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are available free wherever you listen to podcasts.